Okay, calm down.
We're bringing on our next guest, and we're so excited to bring this guy back onto the show. You loved him when he was here, so we had to bring him back on. Zachary Foster has a Ph.D. in Near Eastern Studies from Princeton University. He is a fellow at the Rutgers Center for Security, Race, and Rights. He runs a digital archive called Palestine Nexus and writes a newsletter called Palestine in Your Inbox. He's a Jewish American historian of Palestine who was a Zionist until he started studying Palestine. So welcome, Zachary.
Katie, pleasure to be back. Thanks for having me.
Thanks so much for coming back.
It's my pleasure.
So I wanted to have you on because I wanted to have you on anyway. But then also there's this op-ed in Newsweek. And by the way, one of Newsweek's op-ed editors is none other than Batya Ungar-Sargon, who we mentioned earlier. And there is a piece that went viral because all the people who are Israel supporters sent it to all their anti-Zionist friends and thought it was such an own because it was not only critical of Hamas and Palestinians and exonerating of Israel, but it was written by a Palestinian. And this is what it was called. My fellow Palestinians, stop blaming the Jews. Hamas is starving our brothers and sisters in Gaza. And it was written by Bassem Aid, who is a kind of Zionist apologist. Some people consider him a collaborator. And he makes videos for places like PragerU, just to give you a sense of his politics. And so I thought it would be really useful if we could just go through some of his points.
Yeah. First of all, I didn't realize he gave lectures to PragerU.
Yeah.
I think that probably
Says a
tells
lot,
you
right?
about enough to know what to expect with this piece. But I almost think it's worth just going line by line through this piece, Katie, because it's a pretty short piece.
Yeah, it is.
And you can scarcely get through a single sentence without him saying something so egregiously false. I mean, the piece starts off here, right? The first sentence is, how can we understand the terrible self-imposed deprivation now gripping the people of Gaza? So let's just pause right there. It's the people of Gaza who imposed famine and starvation on themselves. And they imposed genocide on themselves. I mean, even the most generous misinterpretation of the sentence is that Hamas imposed genocide on the Palestinians. But that's a misinterpretation of the sentence, right? Because he explicitly calls out the people
of
Gaza,
right? It's
for
not
being
Hamas.
the cause of their own genocide and intentional starvation. So that's the first sentence of the article. And then I think he proceeds, and then the heart-wrenching stampede that unfolded in Gaza last Thursday casts a stark light on the brutal reality of life under Hamas's rule. So there was an Al Jazeera piece that came out, and there were other journalists who covered the story of the Flower Massacre that has been inaccurately described as a stampede by the Israeli military, right? Because a stampede shifts the blame from the Israeli military to the Palestinians who are being starved by the Israeli military. But in fact, there was reporting done in the hospital immediately after after this Flower Massacre, in which, quote, a majority, I think the reporters said that a majority of the people who were killed in that massacre were killed from gunshot wounds.
Right. There was a bullet stampede. There was a stampede of bullets.
A stampede of bullets. That's exactly right. So to the extent that there was a stampede, well, guess what caused a stampede? It was Israeli tanks firing shells and Israeli soldiers firing bullets onto people they were starving.
Right. Absolutely disgusting.
And the fact that he can call this, and the fact that he can just sort of glance over that fact and ignore who was actually responsible for this massacre is totally disgusting. And again, we're still on sentence 2 here.
Right. Exactly. Yeah. Okay. So you want to keep going?
It's a somber reminder of the urgent need to address the suffering. Oh, wow. Great. Wow. You want to address the urgent needs of the suffering people of Gaza after having just blamed them for a genocide being committed against them. The chaos and desperation that led to this tragedy are a direct outcome of Hamas's governance. Okay, let's just pause there. So why are there 2.3 million people starving in the Gaza Strip? Well, it's because in the decade and a half leading up to October 7th, Israel imposed a blockade and a siege on Gaza, which had left 80% of households in the Strip dependent on food aid to survive. So that's the lead up to October 7th. And then beginning in October 7th, for about a month, Israel shut off all food, all water, all electricity, all fuel And then only owing to, and then they would have continued doing that, by the way, only owing to American pressure. Did they start to allow a trickle of trucks in beginning in late October and November, but the number of trucks didn't reach into the hundreds until I think well into December or January, and then in February, both the World Food Program, the WFP, and UNRWA reported that they could no longer deliver aid to the north. And why couldn't they deliver aid to the north? Because there was no law and order. Because whenever Palestinian police come out in the streets, Israel slaughters them. So they're all hiding. So there's no police. So there's no law and order. And so if there's no law and order, you can't deliver aid. Because what happens is you have literally thousands of tens of thousands of starving people rushing the convoys, and you can't deliver any aid. It's just as everyone is saying, it's chaos. And then on top of all that, the Israeli military shoots at the people who are going after the aid. And by the way, they were doing that long before the Flower Massacre. This has been reported a number of times. In mid-January, the Human Rights Organization, they reported that Israel sent a drone helicopter and slaughtered 50 Palestinians, injuring many, many dozens more. This is mid-January. This is a month before the Flower Massacre. They were slaughtering Palestinians, collecting aid in the north. And the reason for all of this is very, very obvious. This is starvation is being used as a weapon of war. That's Human Rights Watch reporting that, not me. It's being used as a weapon of war. Why? Because Israel, according to Bibi Netanyahu, wants to thin out the population. Those are his words. So we have from the top, from the Israeli prime minister, the goal of the operation in the north is to starve everyone out. And that's exactly what they're doing. So for this Bassem Eid fellow to come out and say the chaos and desperation that led to the tragedy is an outcome of Hamas's governance, there is no Hamas governance. They're being pushed underground. Shameful, shameful. So then let's maybe scroll down a bit. To pave the way for peace and stability, all of a sudden now the people who he's egregiously blamed for their own genocide are now his brothers and sisters. I mean, just the duplicitousness of this article and the pretense that he cares about people he's blaming for the genocide that's being perpetrated against them is just truly, I don't even have words to describe it, but
Repugnant.
it's absolutely repugnant. It is essential to acknowledge the root cause of their suffering. Okay, so why is it that people in Gaza are suffering? I mean, there's so many ways to approach this question.
Well, let's get this one out of the way too, okay?
Yeah,
So Hamas's diversion of resources, suppression of dissent, and neglect of civilian needs must end. Okay, so that's what he would say, obviously.
yeah. So I think that you hear this a lot, right? Oh, if only Hamas, didn't spend all their money on tunnels, then alas, the people of Gaza would be flourishing. I mean, I would say first of all, if your argument is that no governing authority can spend money on defense and security, well, then guess what? The state of Israel has the second highest poverty rate in the developing world, by the way, and it
I
ranks
know that.
sixth among the top 40 military spenders in the world. Israel ranks sixth in military spending. 4.5% of its GDP is spent on its military. So if you want to start to say, okay, well, any governing authority and then the United States, the country that backs and supports Israel, spends $800 billion a year on defense. 20% of its annual budget it spends on defense. And so if there was ever a country in the world you should be blaming for spending its money on arms and weapons and bombs and planes, rather than spending money on food aid and healthcare and civilian infrastructure, well, then it's first the United States and second it's Israel. But obviously he's not interested in critiquing the people perpetrating the genocide. He's interested in critiquing the victims of the genocide because he's a human rights activist and cares deeply about human rights. Just to continue the article here, the international community, along with the Palestinian people, must demand accountability. As a Palestinian human rights activist, deeply sympathetic to the plight of the Palestinian people. Here we go again, more with these flowery overtures expressing his deep sympathy of the Palestinian people and the complexities. Again, it's always complex, right?
Always so complex, yeah.
It's actually not that complex, Bassem. It's actually pretty simple. You have a military whose stated intent is to commit a genocide, and that's exactly what they're doing. It's actually incredibly simple. Um, so the complexities of the Israeli-Palestinian conflict, the responsibilities of course, all owing to Hamas.
Right.
So
I can
scrolling
tell you
to
beyond the shadow of a doubt that the terrorist group Hamas is responsible for the suffering of the Gazans. Okay, let's scroll.
exactly. So then he gets into a bit of history, and here I do think it is worth actually addressing some of these points because again, he's spewing misinformation and spreading lies that have been debunked already for years. So the first lie that he shares here is that Israel, and the other curious thing about this sentence, which I'll read in a second, is that he acts as if a unilateral withdrawal from the Gaza Strip is somehow a good thing. He says, "quote Israel unilaterally withdrew all of its soldiers and settlers from Gaza in 2005. Within hours, Hamas-aligned looters had stripped bare and destroyed the greenhouse farms that Israel had left behind for local subsistence." Oh my God, where to even begin? Okay, so okay, at the time, if you recall, in 2005 the entire international community, including the United States, critiqued Israel for its unilateral decision that if you want to actually give land back and give control back to the Palestinians, guess what? You have to coordinate that with them. You can't do it unilaterally because guess what happens when you do it unilaterally? It leads to disorder and chaos because there's no governing authority that's going to take control when you leave. And that's exactly what happened, as he himself documents in the next sentence when he says Hamas aligned looters had stripped bare. So, again, because Israel did it unilaterally, there was a chaotic transfer of power in which there was a ton of looting. But this sentence is so insidious because he says Hamas aligned looters. Now, I went back and read the reporting. I read that article he links to and looked for other reporting here. Huh, there, there's no indication whatsoever that any of these people had anything to do with Hamas. And you already know that from the sentence because he says Hamas aligned, which is another way of saying they're not
It's not
Hamas.
Hamas, right?
Again,
Also,
like, yeah.
I mean, I think we've talked about this, but I just think it's so stunning that Israel defenders love saying that they pulled out as if it was this act of generosity and exactly what Palestinians wanted. You see, we did what they wanted, and look what happens. But we know from a top advisor of Ariel Sharon that their disengagement plan was, as he put it in an interview with Haaretz, it was political formaldehyde. It killed the peace process. It killed the two-state solution doing what they did. They knew that.
Yeah, that was part of the point, right? It was to divide the Palestinians. Now that you have basically Gaza and the West Bank now under two separate governing authorities, now you have essentially two separate regimes controlling them too, because now you have Gaza being controlled from the inside, whereas but Israeli withdrawing from the perimeter. Whereas in the West Bank, obviously there's Israeli militaries everywhere. So now there are essentially two separate regimes. And then on top of all that, obviously Israel never withdrew at all. I mean, it withdrew its troops, positioning them around the perimeter, but it didn't give up control of the airspace. It didn't give up control of 6 of the 7 land borders. It didn't give up control of what goes in and out of the strip. In fact, it tightened what goes in and out of the strip. It didn't give up control of the coastline or who could fish and to what point they could fish. And of course, it didn't give up control of the population registry either. So ultimately, according to all international legal experts I'm familiar with, Israel was still the occupying power long after it, quote unquote, withdrew its troops and withdrew its settlers. And I think if you look back at the reporting at the time, it's pretty clear what Ariel Sharon's intention was. His intention was to be able to wash his hands of the Gaza Strip. He didn't want there to be any Israeli settlers there because if you recall, in the previous few years, they were being subject to attacks all the time. And so his idea was, let's just withdraw from the perimeter. It's much easier to control these people from the outside than when we're entangled, and we have our civilian population on the inside where we're constantly defending. I mean, some of the worst cases of Israel using Palestinians as human shields were taking place in those early 2000s. You had in cases where you had basically Palestinian homes. The Israeli military would set up an outpost. This is, I think, in 2001. There was an ABC Australia report that came out describing about how the Israeli military would literally set up a military base on the rooftop of a Palestinian home in Gaza, and they required a Palestinian be present in the home at all times. They could not, because that would protect the Israeli military. That would prevent any kind of attacks on the home. So just so insidious for him to pretend as if it was the Israeli military was true, when in fact it was Israeli military that strengthened it's tight and tightened its grip and
Right.
control over the strip.
Someone put in the comment, you can't bomb when you're inside.
That's there's a historian of colonialism. His name is escaping me, but he talked about how in Europe in the 19th century there were two types of wars that Europeans fought. They fought wars in Europe. Those were civilized wars where you had to abide by the laws of war because you were dealing with other civilized peoples. But then you had the wars of the jungle, in which case you didn't have to abide by any of these laws of the war because you weren't dealing with civilized peoples. You were dealing with peoples in faraway countries who didn't deserve the same rights that Europeans deserved, and so you could just commit all kinds of genocides and massacres against them. And that's what Europeans did, and that's what Germans did in Namibia in the early 20th century. That's what white settlers did in the United States in the frontier. That's what white European settlers did in Australia and South Africa and everywhere else, right? Because they were dealing with the uncivilized peoples, and so just the same rules didn't apply. And so you could apply that same logic to what Israel did in Gaza, right? It was now that we've left, there's no longer entanglement. We don't have no civilized people or left in Gaza. You can basically just wipe them off the face of the earth.